Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. Today is Wednesday. It is the 22nd of February, and we're getting ready for Parshas Terumah. Aside from Parshas Terumah, we've also entered into Chodesh Adar. We've entered into the month of Adar, and Mishenichnas Adar Marvin B'Simcha. We want to bring ourselves to a great sense of joy in this month. And because the joyous part of Adar always revolves around Purim, I want to share with you something from Megillas Esther as well today. So what I want to share with you is three insights, two of them on Parshas Terumah that are very closely related, and then a third item that is from Megillas Esther. And surprisingly, you'll see that this item relates to what we're going to see in Parshas Terumah as well. So let's jump right in. So beginning with Parshas Terumah. So let's take a look right at the beginning of the Parsha. The Torah says, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe le'mor." God speaks to Moshe and he says, "Daber al bnei Yisrael." I want you to speak to the Jewish people, v'yichu li truma, and have them take for me an offering. Me'es kol ish asher yidvenu libo, from everyone whose heart inspires him to give. Tichu es trumasi. You should take an offering. That's how the Parsha begins. And this is going to be used, all the funds and materials that are collected are going to be used in order to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that portable mikdash that was used in the wilderness. So I want to start by pointing out something from Rav Shimon Schwab. Let's learn something from Rav Schwab together. Rav Schwab had an insight here that I thought was very interesting. So this is from Rav Schwab's Sefer on Chumash, Ma'ayan Beis HaShoeva, and he writes as follows: Daber al bnei Yisrael v'yichuli truma me'es kol ish asher yidvenu libo. That the pasuk begins, the parsha begins by telling us that we're about to build a mishkan, this portable mikdash in the wilderness, and therefore everyone is being asked to voluntarily donate goods, materials, and funds for this important project. So let's see what Rav Schwab says. Hinei, behold, nidvasa mishkan bami bnei Yisrael avadam. All of the donations that went into the building of the Mishkan, of this tabernacle, only came from the Jewish people. Amnam, however, matzinu kishabana Shlomo Beis Hamikdash, that when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis Hamikdash, nistayeh mechiram v'anashav asher lo bnei Yisrael hema. He had a lot of help. It wasn't just that by the Mishkan, what we're going to read about in this week's Parsha, not only were all the donated goods coming from Am Yisrael, but all the craftsmen who were working on it were also Jews. That's very different than Shlomo HaMelech's first Beis HaMikdash. The first Beis HaMikdash that was built by Shlomo HaMelech, there was an incredible amount of help that he got from Hiram, a neighboring kingdom whose king was named Hiram. He had sent the expert craftsmen. He had sent for them to go and have a hand in building the Beis Hamikdash. Asher lo bnei Yisrael hema. They were not Jews. Ulumazeh. But then what's also very interesting is look at the Bayis Sheni. Look at the construction of the second Beis Hamikdash that you'll read about in Ezra. There it says, Lo lachem v'lanu livnos Beis le'Elokeinu. Is that Ezra and Nehemiah specifically tell others, Gentiles, who had wanted to get involved in the project, they're saying, no, this is not a project that's meant for Jew and Gentile. This is just meant for the Jewish people. They prevented Gentiles, they prevented non-Jews from getting involved in the construction of the second Beis Hamikdash. So he says, V'tzarech bir, this needs to be explained. So what Rav Schwab is noticing is that there's a fascinating pattern here. There are three structures that are built to house God's glory. You have the Mishkan, and then you have Beis Hamikdash number 1 and Beis Hamikdash number 2. Notice there's some clear differences between who is being involved in the building. When it comes to the Mishkan, it's built exclusively by Bnei Yisrael, by members of the Jewish people. The next item that's built is Bayis Rishon, Shlomo HaMelech's Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash, and that is built, it's a combination. Yeah, Jews were involved, but he brought in expert craftsmen from Tyre, from the king Hiram, who sent his expert craftsmen. So it was not exclusively Jewish, the construction of that. And then contrast that again, going back to the second Beis HaMikdash that was built by Ezra and Nehemiah. That was an exclusively Jewish project. So how do we explain this? That you look at this, it swings back and forth. You have the Mishkan is an exclusively Jewish project as far as the construction goes. Bayis Rishon, the first Beis HaMikdash, that's a mixed bag. But then when it comes to Bayis Sheni of Ezra and Nehemiah, there again, it's exclusively Jewish construction. What is going on? And this can't just be an accident. How can we make sense of this? That's what Rav Schwab points out. I don't think I ever stopped to think about this before. So let's see what Rav Schwab's theory is. He says as follows: Venira, it appears as you can explain this in the following manner. Ki binyano shel Shlomo hayabonoi lekarev kol bnei adam el avodas Hashem shechem echad. The whole project of Shlomo Melech, the first Beis HaMikdash, was to try to unite humanity. Of course, the Beis HaMikdash was primarily for the purposes of Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, drawing closer to God. But there was a second purpose, and there was almost a universal aspect to the first Beis HaMikdash. It was meant to inspire humanity around the world and to draw them into worship of the one Creator. And he says there's an allusion to this. If you look at Yeshaya, if you look at what the pasuk says, Yeshayahu Hanavi, what did he say as follows? Ki beisi beis tefillah yikarei l'chol amim. Yeshayahu says that about that Beis HaMikdash, Rav Schwab seems to saying it was primarily that came to its zenith with the first Beis HaMikdash it was a beisi beis tefillah yikarei l'chol amim. It was a house of prayer, and it would call out to all of the nations, and all the nations could use it in a sense to call out to Hashem as well. If you look at Shlomo Melech's own words, his own tefillah that he uttered when the dedication ceremonies took place for the first Beis HaMikdash, it says, "Shebinyan HaBeis HaMikdash haya gam letachlis hakravas nidarei shar umos." Is that one of the purposes of the first Beis HaMikdash was that it should be a place where Gentiles would be able to offer some forms of karbanos, of offerings. Because the pasuk says in Malachim, when it's describing what Shlomo HaMelech's goals and his aspirations were for the first Beis HaMikdash, we see it in his prayer that he recited when the Beis HaMikdash was dedicated. It says, "V'gam el anochri asher lo me'amcha Yisrael." Shlomo HaMelech says to God, and don't forget about the Gentile who's not a member of the Jewish people, Uba v'yispalel el habayis hazeh, and his heart brings him to come and to pray in this house. God, you should answer his prayers too. So you clearly see that innate in it with the plan for the first Beis HaMikdash was not just to service Am Yisrael exclusively, but it also was there to service the Umos HaOlam, the other nations of the world. So as a result of that, it makes sense that there was other entities involved or were allowed to be involved in the construction of it. Ki tikva Shlomo, because the hopes of Shlomo HaMelech was that temple that he was building, it will draw to it all of the nations of the world, like what our Nevi'im, our greatest Nevi'im prophesied. What the goal of the Beis HaMikdash was to draw everyone together. Al Bayis HaShlishi b'Mos Mashiach. The way that our Nevi'im describe what the ultimate goal of the third Beis HaMikdash in the Messianic age, in the time of Mashiach, that's what Shlomo was hoping would even occur in that first Beis HaMikdash. So Shlomo HaMelech, with his first Beis HaMikdash, why did he allow Gentile construction, laborers, craftsmen to be involved and to import them into Israel, to be involved in the building of the Beis HaMikdash? Because he saw that part and parcel of that first Beis HaMikdash was going to have this universal appeal. He hoped and prayed it would serve in the capacity of what Hashem saw envisioned for the third Beis HaMikdash. The Alkein Asa Eser Menoros. That's why Shlomo HaMelech didn't just suffice with one menorah. The pasuk says that he built 10 menorahs, Eser Shulchanos, and he had 10 shulchanos. He didn't just have one table for lechem apanim. He had 10 of them. Shemurumazim al riboy avoda al yidei riboy umoshit starfula vinyano. Because what was this symbolic of? Is that, yeah, when we're building a Beis HaMikdash for just one nation, for Am Yisrael, one menorah will suffice, one shulchan will suffice. But if the goal of this Beis HaMikdash is for humanity at large, it might be primarily for Am Yisrael, but it also serves a function for humanity at large, then we need more kalim, we need more menorahs, we need more shulchanos. So that's how he explains that. So Shlomo HaMelech's vision for the first Beis HaMikdash was that it should step into the capacity of what the Nevi'im tell us the third Beis HaMikdash is going to do. There was nothing wrong with that. But because that was its goal, that's why he involved non-Jews in the construction of it. Ma'ashein came tachlis HaMishkan. This is a very big contrast to the whole purpose of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that portable Mikdash of the wilderness. Haisa Edus Yisrael, it served as testimony to the Jewish people, al ashras hashchina b'socham, that God's presence would dwell in their midst. It was proof, it was living testimony that yes, we had been chosen as God's Am Segula, as his treasured nation. Yes, Hashem did forgive us after the sin of the Egel Azav, the golden calf, and he was willing to rest his presence in our midst once again. That was the purpose, the function of the Mishkan. This was for Bnei Yisrael. It was not for the world at large. So he says, "V'lo haya tafkido lekarbanos kol ba'olam." The purpose of the Mishkan was not to serve as a central focus or central place of prayer for the nations of the world when they would come and recognize Hashem. We're not talking about converts. We're talking about people who would remain Gentiles, observe the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, perhaps, but they were not converting to Judaism. So the Mishkan was not for them. The Mishkan was for B'nai Yisrael. So he says, Al Kain Nivne Rak Min Nidvas B'nai Yisrael. That's why it was built only from donations coming from B'nai Yisrael and only by craftsmen who are part of the Jewish people, because this is ours. This is our project. When something's exclusively ours, there's no reason to get other sets of hands involved. This is personal. This is meant for us, not for the world at large. This was very intimate. The Mishkan was extremely intimate. So he says, V'chein bayis, that also was the purpose of the second Beis HaMikdash. Shebanu habayis Beis HaMikdash betkufa shelo hayu ba melech v'navi. That second Beis HaMikdash was built by Ezra and Nehemiah for a point in Jewish history where we did not have a melech, we did not have a Jewish king, and prophecy was waning. It wasn't long. Ezra and Nehemiah are the last of the Nevi'im. There's really no Nevi'im at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. They realized that prophecy was coming to an end, and we need to do something to strengthen that bond between Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Jewish people. So he says, Havinu, they understood, Shetachlis Habayis Hazeh, Ezra and Nehemiah understood that the entire purpose of the second Beis HaMikdash, Davka Libnei Yisrael Atzmam. This is meant exclusively for Bnei Yisrael. It's not for the nations of the world. Come on, Mishkan Shel Moshe, just like the tabernacle of Moshe. So that's why they did not get involved with donations and craftsmen from other nations. That's why they didn't give an outlet for other Gentiles, for nations of the world, to get involved in the construction of the second Beis HaMikdash. That's also why in the second Beis HaMikdash, they only made one menorah. They didn't follow Shlomo's lead. Shlomo in the first Beis HaMikdash had 10 menorahs and 10 shulchanos. In the second Mikdash, they brought it back to the original format of the Mishkan, just one menorah, with shulchan echad, and only one shulchan, kedugmas HaMishkan, just like the template that was set by Moshe Rabbeinu with the Mishkan. So I thought that's fascinating. The way Rav Schwab's understanding this is that there's a clear connection between the Mishkan and the second Beis HaMikdash. Those were projects that were exclusive for Bnei Yisrael. It had to do with the relationship between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. It had nothing to do with the nations of the world. And that's why we'll find in this week's Parsha and Terumah, Moshe's only accepting donations of goods, materials, talent, and the engineering, all the craftsmen, everything is coming from Bnei Yisrael. That was the model of the second Beis HaMikdash that Ezra and Nehemiah did, because they said this is not about the world at large. This is about Bnei Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The first Beis HaMikdash, that's the anomaly. The first Beis HaMikdash that was built by Shlomo HaMelech, Shlomo had universal designs of that Beis HaMikdash. He saw that there was going to be a place for that first Beis HaMikdash for the world at large. And he said he got that idea from the Nevi'im, who described that about the third Beis HaMikdash. So God willing, we'll see that again in the third Beis HaMikdash. We'll see that soon. But the Mishkan and the second Beis HaMikdash were absolutely not part of that template. Though it was a different model. That was a different goal of what the Mishkan, the second Beis HaMikdash, were going to be. And that's reflected in who contributed the goods as well as the services, the construction, to make that into a reality. I thought that was a fascinating observation by Rav Schwab. But what this also did was it reminded me about something I had seen several years ago from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and this was in Parshas Bo. And this was fascinating. In this, Rabbi Kamenetsky kind of went on a tangent to talk about what he understood the goal of the second Beis HaMikdash was. In other words, Rav Schwab just told us that the Mishkan was exclusive. It was all between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. The first Beis HaMikdash expands on that. The first Beis HaMikdash is somewhat universal. Now it seems as if with the second Beis HaMikdash, we kind of contract again. We go back to that original model that this is just between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. And Rav Schwab didn't really explain that, but I want to show you from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky how this could piggyback on what Rav Schwab said. Because we're going to see from Rabbi Yaakov has a theory as to what the entire goal of the second Beis HaMikdash was, which is a fascinating theory. Just to tell you the context of this, he's in Parshas Bo. In Parshas Bo, the pasuk says, "Achodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodeshim." That's where you have the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh and setting up the Jewish calendar. And Rav Yaakov starts on a piece here about how odd it is that our months, the months that we have, Adar, Nisan, Sivan, Iyar, and then we had Sivan, and then Tammuz, Av, all these names of these months, these are not Hebrew names. These are not Jewish names, so to say. Bnei Yisrael brought these names back with them from Bavel when they returned from the Babylonian exile and set up in Israel. And he wanted to get into this idea of understanding why was that? They were in this mission when Ezra and Nehemiah brought Bnei Yisrael back to set up the second Beis HaMikdash. They were trying to fully reclaim their Yahadus. Ezra and Nehemiah were on a campaign to get everyone to become recommitted to the Torah. So doesn't it seem odd that they brought back the names of these months that are not the Jewish names, not Hebrew names, they're Babylonian names and Persian names. They brought these, and those names stuck. That's what Rabbi Yaakov was starting with. And in the course of answering that question, he suggests a theory as to what the whole goal of the second Beis HaMikdash was. And then he says, based on this theory, he gets back to answering his original question. So we're not going to really focus on his original question today about that question that he raised about why are the names of our Jewish months, why did those stick as non-Jewish names? Why didn't we replace them with authentically Jewish names? We're not going to deal with that. We're going to focus on, in that piece, he gets into what did he see as the goal of the second Beis HaMikdash? How did Chazal understand it? And we're going to see a fascinating footnote as well. So let's see. Rav Yaakov writes as follows. V'nira, it appears, she'olei Bavel, those Jews who returned to Israel from Bavel that were led by Ezra and Nehemiah. Shabanu es Bais Hasheni, they built the second Beis HaMikdash. Yadu, they knew Hilo ze abin in asher yamod lo lamim. They had an idea. They had either, you could say it was prophetic wisdom that Ezra and Nehemiah had. This is not going to be eternal. This is not permanent. When we're coming here to Eretz Yisrael and building the second Beis HaMikdash, this is not the final Beis HaMikdash. This is going to have a limited shelf life. V'ein chazarasam l'Eretz Yisrael b'tkufa zu ha'geula shalema. And they also understood that returning to Israel now, this is not the ultimate redemption. This is for a limited time. Daita Maisa, their mindset was ki binyan abayis b'tkufa azos, building the second Beis HaMikdash at that point in Jewish history. Lo noad ella lahachin esa'am l'tkufas hagalas arucha. The whole point of the second Beis HaMikdash was to position us and give us the strength that we needed for the extremely long exile which still laid ahead. They knew full well this was not the end of the road. We had experienced 70 years in Bavel where we suffered terribly in terms of assimilation, but that we came back to Israel for that second commonwealth to build the second Beis HaMikdash. But Ezra and Nehemiah knew that's not the end of the story. This is not going to last. It's not permanent. We're going to go into exile again, and the next exile is going to be much longer than the 70 years of Galus Bavel. And the whole purpose of the second Beis HaMikdash was to give us the strength and to give us the capability to be able to handle that long and bitter exile that we're still in. So in a certain sense, the second Beis HaMikdash was like a shot in the arm. It was a shot in the arm of vitamins that we needed in order to enable us, give us the strength, the nutrients we needed to make it through the long Galus. Let's see how he develops this. Al Pishuras Adin, according to the letter of the law, they should have had to remain in Bavel for much longer than just 70 years. God, in his divine intervention and his divine wisdom, God saw that only after 70 years, not long, just 70 years of the second of Galus Bavel, of that exile in Bavel, the majority, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people had completely mixed in and become assimilated with the Gentile society. Uvara, remember, just by the way, what occurs at the end of the 70 years of the Babylonian exile? What in Tanakh occurs? Whole story of Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther begins that Bnei Israel are terribly assimilated, and that Seuda, that banquet that Achashverosh made, was to celebrate that assimilation. That's how the Megillas Esther begins. That's at the end of the 70 years of Galus Bavel. We were in a bad place. We were terribly assimilated. Ubarak Hashemesh, and God saw it as clear as the sun. Haya it was. If we were to remain in that Galus Bavel, that exile in Babylonia, for hundreds more years or 1,000 years, we would never retain our individual and unique status and our unique mission of Am Yisrael. And then God wouldn't have a people to redeem. We assimilated so fast and in such great numbers in Bavel in just 70 years. Hashem says, okay, we got to get them out of here. They still have, for the national mission to come to fruition, there's a lot more Galus, there's a lot more exile ahead, and there's more parts of the world where Bnei Israel needs to be. But they can't continue as they are now. They need a shot in the arm. They need something to give them the strength to get through that long Galus. Therefore, God took mercy on his people, and he took them out of Babylonia, and he returned them to Israel, in a very short amount of time, just 70 years, L'Eretz Yisrael, back to Israel. And Ezra and Nehemiah said, we need to do everything. Now we need a crash course, and we need basically emergency infusion of Judaism for the next period of time that will be in Israel. That's what's going to give us the strength we need to make it through the much longer Galus, the much longer exile that we're going to have to face. The whole purpose of why we went back to Israel after 70 years and why we built that second Beis HaMikdash, we needed to go back to Israel so we could strengthen ourselves in the fundamental aspects of Jewish belief and Jewish faith, so we could be armed, so we could be fortified, so we can be strong enough to have the fortitude that it would take to survive that long, bitter Galus, which Bnei Israel still had to face. And in order to emphasize to the Jewish people that we're not done, we've got more Galus ahead of us. We are not at the end of our rope yet. So he says, in order to emphasize this point, that we have not achieved the eternal salvation yet. And even though we're in Israel experiencing the second Beis HaMikdash, we really still are in exile. He says that's why the Aron was not back for the second Beis HaMikdash. Yeshayahu HaMelech hid it at the end of the first Beis HaMikdash. It was not back. We did not have the Aron or the Luchos in the second Beis HaMikdash. Why not? Why didn't Ezra and Nehemiah reveal its location and then take it back? Because they were trying to send a message to Bnei Israel. This is not the final redemption. We're just here for a period of time. It would be about 400 years, a little more than 400 years, but it was just a period of time to give us the strength that we need to get our nutrients and to get our everything we need, so we'll be able to handle a much longer Galus. Mekora Kedusha Bais Harishon. That's why they did not have the Aron, the Ark, which was the whole source of sanctity during the first temple. They never retrieved it from the place where it was hidden by Yoshio Melech, and they left it in that spot. They were trying to send a message to Bnei Yisrael. We're not at our final point in Jewish history. We have not achieved the final salvation. We are going to be exiled again. It's going to be much longer, much more bitter, but we are here now to stock up and to strengthen ourselves so we'll be able to handle the longer exile. After 70 years, we were depleted. We couldn't do anymore. So Hashem brought us back to give us the strength that we need by experiencing the second Beis Hamikdash in order to be handle a much longer exile. But that really begs the question, well, what happened during that second Beis Hamikdash? What happened that gave us the fortitude? So for that, we go to the footnote here. The footnote says, what does Rav Yaakov say? So this is his children and his Talmidim record this. B'chidushav al Pirkei Avos. Rav Yaakov touches on this theme again in his sefer he wrote on Pirkei Avos, and that's also where I saw this. Bia Rabbeinu. There, Rav Yaakov explains, Shechelek me'asiba shechziram Hashem yisparach l'Eretz Yisrael. Why? What was also part of the reason why Hashem said, I need to bring the Jewish people back to Israel for that second Beis Hamikdash? Haisa b'shvil sheyicholu la'asof la'aroch es haTorah shebal peh. That's what happened during that time period. The Anshe Knesset Hagdola get together and they compile, they bring the Rav Yehuda on us, he gets together, all the sages of the Mishnah. That's when this happens, towards the end of the second Beis Hamikdash period. That's what happens. And it was only by being back in Eretz Yisrael, having that Beis Hamikdash, that's what enables Torah Shebal Peh to get clarified and to be recorded, which would then be able to give us the strength we need, the fortitude we need, give us the ability to be able to make it through this long and bitter galus. If we did not have our Torah Shebal Peh fully ensconced and we didn't have it written, we would never survive such a long, bitter exile. So it was Torah Shebal Peh had to come together. They had to make all their votes about who the halacha was like. It had to be clarified, so many points of halacha, and then it had to be written. Everything had to be done. Only then could Bnei Yisrael have the strength to make it through a long and bitter galus. Look what he says, it continues. Ki yada ashkacha, God's wisdom understood, shebishvil lahachzik maimar galus. In order for Bnei Yisrael to have the strength to make it through a very long galus, shuvi yavshar shiyah Torah shebal peh nachalasam apratis shel chachmei Torah. Torah Shebal Peh are oral traditions that cannot just be the purview, that could just not be the property of our greatest sages. It has to be available to the masses. Every member of Bnei Yisrael has to have access to this body of information. That's also why there were a number of gezeras. There were a number of decrees that were made in order to prevent the abundance of intermarriage. That's where you'll find that there were so many gezeras made, whether it was on wine, stam yenam, that we're not going to have wine that wasn't kosher. What's not kosher about wine? It's just grapes. What's not kosher? It was a gezerah Chazal made because of chasnus, that it's going to lead to intermarriage. The more we drink and with our neighbors who aren't Jewish, the more likely it is we're going to knock down all our barriers and we'll end up marrying their daughters will marry our sons. They also made a gezerah on pas akum, on bread of Gentiles. What's not kosher? So again, here, what does it mean? Why did a Jew have to turn on the oven? What's that all about? Again, that was a gezerah mishum chasnus. It shouldn't lead to intermarriage. They also made a gezerah on oils, but Klal Yisrael said that's too much. We couldn't handle that. That's why it's not observed. You could go to any store, look for an OU, and buy olive oil, even though that may not have been produced by Jews, because we never accepted that gezerah. So look what he says further. All of those gezeras were made during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash to give us the tools that we needed to create some distance between ourselves and the Gentiles. So we would not become lost. We wouldn't erase ourselves. We wouldn't assimilate in their midst during a long, long galus. Because Hashem knew some periods of galus, there's no challenge of intermarriage. When we're treated like garbage by our neighbors, who wants to be part of them? But when our neighbors welcome us with open arms, Klal Yisrael does terrible. You're all aware of this, that the rate of intermarriage in the Western world now, outside of the Orthodox community, is above 75%. That was unimaginable a generation or two ago. That's where we are now, and it's only going to get worse. We don't do well when our Gentile neighbors welcome us with open arms. Thank God that's the time we're living in. No one wants to live in a time of persecution, but just understand the reality. The Jewish people never intermarried and assimilated in a society that persecuted us, because who wants to be part of that? And they won't let us be part of that. But here, where all options are open, Jews are opting out like never before in Jewish history. So he's saying that Chazal understood this. We're going to face every type of challenge during a long galus. Some are going to be by our opponents who persecute us, and some are going to be by our most loving societies who kill us with kindness and accept us with open arms. And thank God we're experiencing that. I would hate to live in a time of persecution. So he continues and he says, that's why Chazal, during that time in the second Beis Hamikdash, that's when all these steps were taken. That Torah Shebaal Peh is clarified and recorded to arm every Jew to have this body of knowledge. That's when the gezeras, the different decrees that are meant to curtail intermarriage, that's when they were put into effect. And he continues, he says, Ayin Sham Shapira Dvarim Heitiv. In his commentary to Pirkei Avos, that's where Rabbi Yaakov really spends a lot more time on this. Then he says, look at this, contemporary idea. Od Hosif Rabbeinu Bekama Hizdamyonos. And then Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky adds in many words and in many examples, Shekach Aleinu Lavin, that we also have to understand Gam es Hakamas Medinas Yisrael. That's how we have to understand. Why is it that if we're not at the end of the Geula now, we have not achieved, Mashiach has not come, we have not achieved the final redemption, yet we have achieved something awesome, that Jews have been allowed to return to their homeland, and an independent state of Israel has been established in 1948. B'yameinu, that's in our day and age. How do we understand this? So Rav Yaakov says, here's how to understand it. Shelachar hachurban hagadol, after the terrible Holocaust, where European Jewry, which had flourished for thousands of years, had been decimated. The Hayush, and there was an incredible amount of despair. That all the surviving remnants of Jewry, world Jewry, were feeling. So many ready to throw in the towel after the Holocaust. And more so, lower Matzavama Noash Vanevad Shal Yahudus Russia, that millions of Russian Jews were cut off behind the Iron Curtain. So we suffered such losses by the end of World War II, between all of those Jews who were murdered by the Nazis, between all those communities that were uprooted and destroyed that had stood for millennia, and between a significant chunk of Am Yisrael that had been cut off by the Iron Curtain and forcibly removed, every semblance of Yiddishkeit removed from them by the communists. Jewish people, whatever was left of us, were feeling so down. That's specifically why God caused right then, at that point in history, why the state of Israel would be reborn. In order to give some strength, in order to encourage, in order to lift up the Jewish sense of self-esteem. And also to strengthen the bond between Jews living scattered around the world in the diaspora and the Jewish people and Israel. In order for this all to come to be, that's why Hashem created the modern day state of Israel. So there's Rav Yaakov saying that pretty much that same idea. Why did Ezra and Nehemiah, why Hashem, why did God with his infinite wisdom see that only after 70 years of Galus Bavel, I've got to bring the Jewish people back and build a Beis Hamikdash? And Ezra and Nehemiah understood this. This was not permanent. We're not at the end of the road, but we need a shot in the arm because we suffered so terribly in those 70 years. We were so ill prepared for the 70 years of Galus Bavel. Bnei Yisrael almost fell apart. So after, even though we needed a much longer exile in God's great scheme of things, we can't have that now because we'll fall apart. There won't be any people left to redeem. So Hashem brings us back to Eretz Yisrael with Ezra and Nehemiah. We build a Beis Hamikdash. During that time, Torah Shebaal Peh becomes clarified. It's written down. Every member of Bnei Yisrael gets access to it, Gezeras, decrees are made to try to slow down intermarriage. All this is made. They never would have made those decrees if we were going to stay in Israel, because then what do you got to worry about intermarriage for? All those decrees, Chazal knew this is not the end of the road. The Jewish journey has many more stops out of it, thousands of years of more stops out of it. We have to prepare for that long galus. And that's what was going on during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. This was a time to prepare Bnei Yisrael for the challenges that lay ahead. Look how this dovetails with Rav Schwab so nice. Because again, what did Rav Schwab say? The Mishkan was all about Bnei Yisrael. The second Beis Hamikdash was all about Bnei Yisrael. But why? I understand why the Mishkan was all about Bnei Yisrael, because we were just forming as a people. We had to establish that relationship between God and Bnei Yisrael. We needed to see that proof that Hashem was willing to rest his presence in our midst, even after the sin of the Egel Azav. I get it, why the Mishkan needed to be just an exclusive relationship between Bnei Yisrael and Hashem. But what about the second Beis Hamikdash? Why was that so necessary? Why did that have to be so exclusive, a relationship between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael? So Rabbi Yaakov explains this beautifully, because he says the whole purpose of the second Beis Hamikdash was to energize us, to give us the strength we needed, give us the fortitude we needed, because there's still a long journey ahead. There's a long galus ahead. And Hashem wants to make sure that we have what it takes to emerge from that long galus as Bnei Yisrael. So the whole purpose of the second Beis Hamikdash was all about us. This wasn't a time for the universal needs of mankind coming closer to God. We're not there yet. That's going to be at the Messianic age. That'll be with the third Beis Hamikdash. That whole second Commonwealth, that whole time, that whole kufa, that whole period of Jewish history was all about trying to be mechazik Bnei Yisrael, so we'd have the tools that we need to make it through the long haul of galus, of a long, bitter exile. What a beautiful idea. I think this dovetails, this fits like a glove together with Rav Schwab. This idea from Rav Schwab and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, they go hand in hand together. And what's so nice, I want to share with you a third source. This third source we're going to see is from Megillas Esther. And this source from Megillas Esther dovetails with everything that we've just said. I found this incredible. I couldn't get over the Ashgacha Pratis that I stumbled on this week. Let's take a look at this pasuk from Megillas Esther. It's the last pasuk in all of Megillas Esther. It's in Perek Yud, the 10th chapter, the last pasuk, Gimel. Ki Mordechai Yehudi Mishnah leMelech Achashverosh. Is that Mordechai, the Jew, he had become the viceroy, the second in charge to the king Achashverosh. The Gadol Yudim, he was very great amongst the Jews. V'ratzoy l'rov echav, he was liked or accepted by most of his brothers. Dorish tov la'amo, he was always seeking the good of his people. V'dover shalom l'chol zaro, and he spoke peace to all of his offspring. That's the last pasuk in Megillas Esther. I never really stopped and thought about the last half of that pasuk before. The last half of that pasuk, there's a Rashi on the first part of that pasuk that we're all familiar with. Rashi on the first part says, what does it mean that Mordechai was Ratzoi l'rov echav? So he quotes that to the majority of his brothers, but not all his brothers. So he quotes the Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah says that Mordechai had a lot of people who were griping about him. You're never going to make everyone happy, both as a leader. I think we're all spinning our wheels if we're waiting for 100% approval rating. It's never going to happen. And I'll be the first to tell you that, but there's plenty before me who will tell you you're never going to get 100% approval rating. It's never going to happen, especially when you're dealing with Klal Yisrael. We're a finicky, we're not an easy people. I don't think it takes a genius to look at the Torah and realize Moshe didn't have it so easy himself. There's no leader in Bnei Yisrael. I don't care if it's on a national level, even on a local level, even dealing with a small chunk, you're never going to get unanimity amongst Bnei Yisrael. We are not an easy people to govern. So the Gemara says that, it's l'rov echav, but not everyone. But the Gemara says it for a little bit more. It says there were people who had tainas, there were people who had complaints about Mordechai. Mordechai had started off, he was one of the last living members of the Sanhedrin. That when the first Beis Hamikdash stood, Mordechai was one of the young members of the Sanhedrin. 70 years later, in Galus Bavel, he was one of the last living survivors of the Sanhedrin. And Bnei Yisrael was used to him having functioned as a member of the Sanhedrin. He was someone who was totally absorbed in the Jewish people and Torah learning. And now that he became viceroy to the king, he had to be involved in other stuff. So he wasn't as involved in his Torah studies as before. There were people who had gripes on him. That's the Rashi quotes that on the first half of his pasuk. Why is it Rov Echav? But there's a Rashi on the second part. I don't think I ever noticed until this year. Let's look at the second Rashi. Rashi is going on. What's going on at the end of the pasuk? The second part of the pasuk says, "Doresh tov le'amo." Mordechai was constantly seeking, or was seeking good for his people. The dover shalom, and he was speaking peace l'chol zaro, for all his offspring. So notice that there's something different there. He's looking for good for his people, speaking peace about his offspring. What does that mean, the offspring? So Rashi says l'chol zaro. What does it mean, the offspring? Musav al amo. That's going back on amo, his people, meaning l'chol zera amo. So meaning what he's saying is that Mordechai, he sought out tov, all good for his people, and then he spoke peace about the zera amo. Zero doesn't mean his own kids; it means the kids of Bnei Yisrael. Still not sitting well. What's going on? So let's take a look at the Be'er Yosef, Rav Yosef Salant. We've looked at some of his other teachings at several parshios this year so far. I came upon his Perush several months ago. I'm enjoying it. Let's take a look at this, what he says here. It's very short. He says, Kasav Rashi, Rashi says, L'chol Zaro. What does the pasuk mean when it says L'chol Zaro? Musav alamo. That's going back on his nation, meaning L'chol Zaramo. So that means that he was Dover Shalom. I'm sorry, Dorish Tov, that he was seeking out the good for his Amo, and he was Dover Shalom. He was speaking peace about the Zera Amo, about the children of his people. So he says, L'chareina, move on. I don't really understand that. Hello, Gam Zera Amo, Nichlalim v'nikrim Amo. That's all part of Amo. In other words, the Amo means his people. So his people includes his people, and it includes the offspring of his people. Why is the pasuk separating them like it's two different entities? I never really noticed this before. So why did the pasuk separate them? Likram amo v'zer amo, to give one group the title of his nation, and the second group to be titled the children of his nation. V'gam nira shechelak ben amo leben zaro. It makes another difference. Shalamo, about his people. What did the pasuk say about them? He was Dorish Tov. That about his people, if you were in that category of his people, he was seeking out good. What can I do to benefit them? Shemashmo shai mishtadel v'dorish tov asam. That he was doing, what can I do? How can I busy myself to seek out their good? Lasosimam tov v'chesed, to do good and kindness for them. Ulam was zaro, but what does it mean for zaro? Zeramo. There it says, Hayarak Dover Shalom. He was just saying peaceful things to. Avalo Dorish Tovasam Lasosimam Tov, but he wasn't going out of his way to do all sorts of good stuff for them. So what's going on here? Excellent question. Who are these two different groups? The first group, when it comes to whoever we classify as Amo, he's Dorish Tov. He's trying to see whatever I could possibly do for them, I'm going to do. The second group that's called Zera Amo, them, he's just Dover Shalom. He's speaking peace. He's speaking nice things about it. He's doing less. So who are these two groups? And why is he doing more for the first group than he is for the second? That's his questions. So he first starts by quoting Evan Ezra. The Evan Ezra wants to say that it's talking about his Zera Amo, means his kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. And he was saying that in some families, the grandkids, great-grandkids, they have a pachad, they have a fear of the Alta Zaydi, of the great Zaydi. So he's saying, no, Dover Shalom, Mordechai did whatever he could to get past that fear. He was always speaking kindness and saying shalom to them, so nobody would be fearful in a terrible state of awe. Okay, that's Ibn Ezra. But he says he wants to offer his own approach. So let's look at the left column. V'ulayev shalomar. Perhaps this is how you can explain it. Galus Bavel, in that first Galus Bavel, the 70 years that the Jews spent in Galus Bavel, the exile of Babylon, which again turns into Persia because the Persians replaced the Babylonian Empire. And remember, Mordechai is living at the end of Galus Bavel. Galus Bavel Umadai, in the exile of Bavel and the Medes, Nasu Nashim Nachrios Me'amei Aretz. There was an incredible amount of intermarriage that took place. Jewish men were marrying tons of non-Jewish women, Gentile women. They were entering into intermarriages. You look at Ezra and Nehemiah, that's one of the major issues. Ezra and Nehemiah are telling them, get rid of your non-Jewish wives. Get rid of them. It's time to drop them off. What's the halacha? Let's say a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman get together and have a kid. What's the status of that kid? Is the kid Jewish or non-Jewish? Havlad Kimosa, the kid goes after the mother. Judaism is passed through the mother. So if a Jewish man and non-Jewish woman get together, that child, that offspring is non-Jewish, Kimosa, just like its mother. Bunachri is a Gentile. B'chol abanim, in the opposite case, let's say you had a Jewish woman and a Gentile man who intermarried. Chol abanim shenoldu lahem min anachrios. I'm sorry, this is still going on the first case. If you have a Jewish man and a Gentile woman, so the kids are non-Jewish. Kol abanim shenoldu lahem min anachrios. All of the kids, the offspring that are born by non-Jewish women, einam nechshavim al am Yisrael. They're not part of the Jewish people. Zeu shamar kan. That's what this pasuk's alluding to. Han al Mordechai. This is what the pasuk's saying about Mordechai. Shaya dorish tov lamo. When it came to his amo, when it came to anyone who was genuinely Jewish, whose mother was Jewish, Mordechai was dorish tov. Hainu al elu shnikru amo. Anyone who was a legitimate member of Am Yisrael, hainu shem Yisraelim gemurim. They are Jewish. Either those kids were a product of both the Jewish mom and dad, or if it was a product of intermarriage, the mom was Jewish. So then they were Yisrael Gemurim. Anyone who is a full-fledged Jew, Aleim Darash Tov Leitivimem. Mordechai was using his station as the viceroy to see what can I do to be of service. But those products of the intermarriage, which may have associated with the Jewish community, but were not authentic Jews, they may have been called Zera Amo. They were the offspring of his nation, but they weren't Amo. Those who were not considered legitimately part of Amo because they're not Jewish, because their mom was not Jewish. So it says, their fathers were Jewish, who married Gentile women. They're just offsprings of Amo. Lahem davar diber rak shalom. All Mordechai did with them is he didn't turn over heaven and earth to see what can I do to better their situations. What did he do? Lem diber rak shalom. He was nice to them. He said peaceful things. Because even if someone was full-fledged non-Jew, a full-fledged Gentile, we have to be a mensch. We've got to be peaceful. We've got to do what we can for them. Just like what Chazal say. So that's what our pasuk's getting at here. That's what our pasuk is alluding to when it's saying there was a difference. Mordechai dealt with two different groups of people, and he did different things for each one of them. There was Amo, the Amo was the full-fledged Jews. He would turn over heaven and earth to see what can I do to help. But on the second group, Zera Amo, they were offsprings of Amo. They're not halachically Jewish, but they got some Jewish blood in them. Those kids that are not halachically Jewish, those products of intermarriage, but they're not really members of Bnei Yisrael. He would speak good, he would be peaceful, he would do nice things, but he wasn't going out of his way, turning over heaven and earth, saying, what can I do for them? But on his people, if someone was a legit member of Bnei Yisrael, Yidorish Tov. So that's how he's learning this last pasuk, and it makes so much sense. Now I understand that Rashi. But look how this dovetails with everything that Rav Schwab and Rav Yaakov were saying. That was the situation in Golus Bavel. After 70 years of Golus Bavel, we had experienced dramatic increase, an incredible rate of intermarriage. And that's why when Hashem saw this, Hashem says, we're not ready. The Jewish people have many more stages to go in order to achieve the Jewish mission. But I can't have them continuing like this. There won't be a Jewish people left. So he brought him back to Eretz Yisrael for that 400 some years of the second Beis Hamikdash. That'll give them Torah Shebaal Peh. It'll clarify Torah Shebaal Peh. It'll give them access to Torah Shebaal Peh. It'll make all these gezeros about what we can do to stave off, to try to prevent intermarriage moving forward. It'll give us the chizuk, the strength that we need, the uplifting that we need in order to handle a much longer Golus. But it was never a permanent solution. It was never intended to be permanent. That's why we didn't have the Aron. That's why we didn't have the Ark. And that's why Rabbi Yaakov goes on to say, that's why they kept the names of the non-Jewish months in order to say, this is not the finale. We're not fully back and reclaiming them in Hebrew, because this is just temporary. That's where Yaakov uses that to address that as well. But look how this all goes together. All this goes together, starting with Rav Schwab saying that the Mishkan was exclusive between Hashem and the Jewish people. The first Beis HaMikdash had themes of the third, which was universal. That's why Shlomo HaMelech got involved, foreign workers and craftsmen. But the second Beis HaMikdash, again, was exclusive between Bnei Yisrael and between Hashem, because it was only meant to be temporary. It was a shot in the arm to give us the strength we need to get through Galus. And how do I know we were doing so bad at the end of Galus Bavel? Then we go to that third source in Megillas Esther. The fact that that final pasuk in Megillas Esther shows us that there were two groups of people who identified with the Jewish community, that Mordechai had to figure out ways to deal with them. Mordechai realized there are two very different groups. There's a group of authentic Jews. There are people here who are legitimately halachically Jewish. I've got one set of responsibilities to them. There's a whole nother group of Jews at the end of Galus Bavel who are not halachically Jewish. They're only Mizera Amo. Let's see what we can do. Maybe we can work on them. Some of them might convert, but until that happens, they're not halachically Jewish, and our responsibility to them is far different than it is to Achenu B'nai Yisrael. So I think that these 3 points go hand in hand with one another to really illuminate for us some information about the Mishkan, both the first and the second Beis HaMikdash, and also Megillas Esther. I find that absolutely fascinating. And again, I'll stop the recording now. And